Good morning, everyone. You are live.
Super fun. Waban, it is morning. It is a new day, and it's so nice to be back here with both you beautiful women and all of our ancestors and all our brothers and sisters and allies out there in the virtual world. It's wonderful.
I love it. So here we are today with NaWalka Geeshy Meegwun. Like, take it away. That's how I feel. You just did our opening.
Fabulous.
Thank you. NaWalka.
Absolutely. And I hope that we're able to come back and return to this conversation once again after I'm done flapping my lips. It's such a beautiful day, you know. This morning I was outside with the dog and I was looking in the backyard and I noticed that my pussy willow is starting to bud, and it reminded me about rebirth. And I started to reflect on how, as Indigenous people, I feel that we're constantly in this cycle of rebirth. That there's different things that are thrown our way or that provides another layer of trauma for us that we have to awaken and we have this rebirth happening. For example, we scratched the surface by opening the door and talking about Canadian Indian Residential School and all the legacy of harm and abuses that went through, that our ancestors and relatives had gone through in that process, but realizing that we're still very much engaged in that kind of harm that has been done and trying to work through that. So through that, we've had a rebirthing, an understanding of who we are. I think one of the best examples that I can think of, what I was thinking about this morning when I was looking at that pussy willow bush, is I don't know more. I think I don't know more was such a magnificent thing that happened, this entity that happened not just in Canada but the United States, right across Turtle Island, and then it just zoomed right across the entire sphere, right across the world, and it was this awakening of the Indigenous spirit. It gave us that power to unite and gave us a power to stand up at any cost. I remember in Hamilton here, I was engaged with, I don't know more, with a magnificent friend and colleague of mine, Micah Burning from Six Nations. And we decided that Hamilton needed to have some I don't know more action. So her and I met, and then we decided that this is the time for an awakening for all of us as Indigenous people. And at any cost, we have to make a stand and let Canada know that we're still here and our voices need to be heard. So we had decided that we're going to shut down the 403. But we wanted to do it responsibly because we knew that we had roles and responsibilities as Indigenous people, that we had young eyes looking at us too. And so we had to do things responsibly. So we called upon the RCMP, we called the OPP, we called the Hamilton Police. We had this meeting at a little restaurant down off of Kenilworth and Main Street. And we told them, we're not here to get your permission. We're just here to tell you that we're going to shut down the highway. And we're engaging you so that you can help us do this in a safe manner. But that awakening, that rebirth that happened for Indigenous people, it's so invigorating. And I'm so happy over the last 10 to 20 years to see our voices, people claiming that space. And that's kind of some of the stuff I want to talk about today, too.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I'm really excited to hear your second part.
And I just want to just kind of go a little bit off of what you were just finished saying about I'll Know More. And I went down to the first one that they had in Toronto quite a few years ago at Christmas time. And when I got off the subway and I got to Yonge and Dundas Square, there was this sense of just, oh my gosh, we finally arrived, because every niche was coming from the four directions, right? Like I just looked around, there was babies, there was moms and dads, and people just coming from the four directions. And you're right, it was that reawakening. And then having that round dance right in the middle of Yonge and Dundas Square, stopping traffic, right, during Christmas. And it was just one of those things that, oh my gosh, I was so honored to be there. And you could just feel ancestors behind you and just the little hairs on the back of your arms and everything just standing up. It was amazing. And I know we need to do more of that. And you're right, talking about talking about the resurgence and reclaiming. And I'm so excited that you're here and learning from you. It's been wonderful. So I'm gonna let you have the rest of the time to teach us and to learn from you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Lyndon. Have a wonderful talk.
I'm so excited, Meegwun, for having me back on this day, and I'm excited to be able to share some more experiences, some of the knowledge and wisdom that I've picked up along my journey. And today's a really good day. I'm feeling really frisky. I'm feeling really excited, and uh, I woke up this morning once more. As I'm putting my beaded hairband on, putting my beads on, and I'm looking in the mirror and thinking to myself, I can see my mom and dad and my grandparents and my great grandparents, my brother and my sister, and all my relatives behind me again today. So I want to acknowledge all my relatives and all my friends and family who have been supportive along this journey. And of course, all of the wonderful, magnificent Indigenous people who have done so much hard work to bring us to this point where we are today, that we're able to have this venue that our grandmothers have provided for us in this region to share and to collect information and to add all these tools to our bundles as we're picking up our bundles. And so the other day, I want to say thank you very much for everybody who came to witness part of my story on Tuesday, as you were able to witness and see me make myself vulnerable. And once again, that sometimes when we share our stories, we have to be willing to make ourselves vulnerable so that people truly understand the impact that trauma and intergenerational trauma and racism, discrimination, and those forms of ugliness have on us as Indigenous people. So I left that conversation talking about how I had come out of the closet, and the feeling that you have when you are finally able to share that part of who you are with your family and with your friends, it's like you have this instant heavy burden that comes off you. And that you're able to finally allow an opportunity for your family and your friends to understand who you really are, and for them to really um, understand things like that you have the capacity to love, and that there's no walls in between your relationship building process that happens, and it's such a magnificent feeling that there's no more of those secrets that are happening in your life. And so after that had happened and I had come out of the closet, I found myself in a space that I really needed to know more about who I was as Anishnaabe Ojokwe, Two-Spirit people. And I should probably share for folks who weren't here on Tuesday who I am. So Bozo Anishnaabe NaWalka Meegwun Anishnaabe Ojokwe. My name is Longfeather. That's my Indigenous name. My cowboy name is Lyndon George. That was the name that was given to me by my parents, that happened to be forced to give us an English name, which probably took them just a couple of months to get. But my Indigenous name, Longfeather, took my father 3.5 years to get, and came with a story about what the message was relayed to him in terms of the meaning of my name, Longfeather, which is that he had been given by our ancestors a vision that I was this young person who was born with these large feathers as arms, and I was constantly going to wander in my life, wanting to bring people into the safety of my big long feathers and protect them from harm. And that really has set a path, the journey for me of the things that I would do in my lifetime. And I hadn't consciously thought that I was doing a self prophecy kind of thing with my name, but rather it was just the doors were opening in that direction. So I've always worked with my own people. But after coming out of the closet, I really wanted to know more about Two-Spirit people. I had heard my dad talk about the history of Two-Spirit people and how we were part of the circle. And so I needed to know more. So I started reading, I started asking people, I started doing whatever I can. And at that time, of course, we didn't have the internet, so I couldn't go Google anything. So it was really going to libraries, going to talk to different people, meeting people wherever I could. Whenever I would go out to queer establishments and I saw an Indigenous person, I would talk to them and ask them what they knew of our history, and they would provide for me what they had learned on their journey. So I am thankful for all those stories and the wisdom that was shared along my path. And so what I had heard and learned about over time about two-spirited people was the ability also to be able to understand what was happening and the change that was going on with Indigenous people at the time when foreigners, when settlers were coming over here to Turtle Island. So it was important for me to understand everything. What happened to us as two-spirit people? Why were we shrouded in our communities? Why had we become disengaged in our circles? Why were we shunned? Why were we not talked about? Why was there this ugly face of homophobia that was plaguing our communities when I was hearing that we had always been part of the circle, that we are a part of tradition? And so what I've come to learn over my journey is to understand that there have been great influences on us as Indigenous people, as there has always been. So on Tuesday, I talked about changes, and it's important that when we look at gender identity, sexuality within Indigenous people, that we understand that there have been enormous influences that have come from foreign cultures. So to understand where we were displaced as two-spirit people, we have to also understand that our journey is very similar to women, and particularly Indigenous women. So what I had found out over the years is that we have to reflect back to what was happening over across the Big Creek, so over in Europe. At the time when settlers were starting to leave their island and come over to our Big Turtle Island, so there was a lot of crazy crap going on over there in Europe. And so they had their organized religion. So they had Catholicism and they had Judeo-Christianity, and the two, the Protestants and the Catholics, could not see to eye. And they were in great wars over there, fighting over land, fighting over power, fighting over resources. And at this particular time, when the settlers were coming over here onto Turtle Island, we must remember the influence, their morals, their values, their beliefs, their standards that they brought with them on those big boats. So we have to take a general look at what was happening. So at the time that the settlers were starting to come over here, the newcomers were coming over here, it was a time period in their history where Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, was in power. And nobody wanted her in power because she was not a Catholic. So that's reflective of the battle, the religious wars that were going on over there. And women did not have a strong voice. Women, you have to have been born into a place of power. Otherwise, women had no strong position within the community. This is also a time of Shakespeare. And we know that in Shakespeare, through his literature and through his history, that women were not able to be actors, that they could not be on a stage, and any woman that would dare get on stage would be dragged out to the center of the village and a pile of rocks put around her, and anybody passing by was encouraged to throw stones at her. So women were often labeled, and in order to justify that, quite often women were labeled as either witches or whores, because it was acceptable then to be able to stone to death and to punish women who were acknowledged as witches and whores. And so that's the kind of history that was happening over there. No women had power over there unless you were born into that monarch role. And so we would see that they were fighting over land, they were fighting over resources. Quickly, land and resources were gone. So the explorers then decided that they were going to hop on their ship and they were going to come across the Big Creek. So it started with the Spanish coming and arriving over in the southern tip and then experiencing, hopping off their big boats, jumping onto Turtle Island and seeing that it was already occupied, but immediately, because we did not meet their standards, their values, their morals, or we were not practicing their beliefs, we became the savages and we became the pagans. We weren't worshiping their virgin idols. We weren't worshiping their Lord, their God. And because of that, they decided that they needed to go back to Spain and talked to Spain about bringing bigger powers back with them in order to occupy this land and claim the land for their rulers. While they were here on Turtle Island, they saw some things that bothered them. So one of the things that they noticed here is that our women had strong voices and that our women had a place in our communities. They also noticed that there were men dressed like women and women dressed like men. So they thought we were completely messed up. And so they hopped back on their big boat, took back off to Spain, and they went and told their leaders there, like, hey, we found you some land, but these people are really messed up. And we have to go over there and we have to show them the true way, the only way. We have to teach them about the Holy Trinity. We have to teach them about how they cannot be savages, pagans. And so the leadership in Spain said, all right, well, and they became very brutal with the indigenous people. And they started to teach by bartering with the men first that men needed to learn how to shut their women up. So we could trace back to these early interactions with the Spanish and the indigenous people, our brothers and sisters in southern parts of Turtle Island, some of the first examples of abuse on indigenous women. So they would do things to persuade the men to, if women opened up their mouth to speak and provide guidance, they would teach the men to slap the women or to beat the women. And if the men did that, they would give them trinkets or they would give and so we would see that abuse started happening with our women. And then they started to teach them the same thing about our two-spirited people. And at this part in history, two-spirited people, indigenous prayer people were honored people just as much as indigenous women were and elders and young people were in our communities because of our roles and responsibilities and the gifts that they carried. And so the Spanish were able to persuade our ancestors, our brothers and sisters to the south that what needed to be done was we needed to dig these big ditches and throw the women with the loud voices and these ditches, and then they would put the mad dogs into these ditches so that they would rip apart our gifted ones, our women and our two-spirit people. And so this is part of the history that I was able to pick up and learn through many of my two-spirit brothers and sisters across Turtle Island throughout the years, and much more, and then learn about some of the historical figures, the historical two-spirit people like Weewa and Oshtish, who are very famous two-spirit people within our indigenous community. So it's important to understand that influence that happens in cultures in regards to women and two-spirit people. And that we know that traditionally two-spirit people carried many different responsibilities and had very significant roles. And the responsibilities were big because two-spirit people carried both the masculine and the feminine teachings in our communities. And that we would learn that our two-spirit people were the child caregivers, were the water protectors, were the drum keepers, the staff keepers, the eagle staff keepers, the language keepers, the name givers, children into our communities. We were the educators, and we were the voices of our relatives who did not have a voice or could not speak. So those things such as the four-legged or the winged or those that slither, those that swim, those that crawl, that was part of our responsibility, that we needed to lift our voices and speak on their behalf should there be any harm that comes to them. So you can see by that demonstration that two-spirit people had many, many roles and responsibilities, and that's why we were important to the circle within our communities. And if many people come believe that communities until two-spirit people reclaimed our places within our communities, and that's what we're starting to see now. And so much of what I've done through along my path has helped aid me in the work that I do and the experiences that I've learned. I remember one of the times where I was after I had left the church that I talked about. I didn't start learning more how to people have to pick up what I could from the little bit that my mom retained, from my dad, from my grandparents, and understanding those things. And then I started leaning towards wanting to understand and more from the healers that would come into my house. But I had reached this point in my life as a young Anishnaabe Ojokwe where I felt like I just wasn't getting enough. But because nobody in our communities were talking about the traditional ways of life, it was very difficult. Everything felt underground, like I had to be secretive in order to seek answers about who I was as a Anishnaabe person. And I remembered years later that I had reached a conflict that I felt some obligation to continue trying to learn from the same counselors over and over. But I also felt that I had reached a level of understanding with them that I felt like I had learned as much as I could from them. And there was nothing left for me to learn at that particular point in my life. But there was this heavy obligation I felt comfortable with them, and that was possible in my life. And I needed to talk to somebody about what was happening. And so I remember going to this remarkable man from my community who was living in the city of London, and his name is Richard Doug George. And Richard Doug George is now the health director in the Chippewas of Kettle and Stony Point, and a magnificent, wonderful human being. If you have the opportunity to connect with him, I encourage you to do that. Had ultimately changed my life. And I went to him and talked to him about this fork in the road that in my journey that I had reached, that this obligation, this heaviness that I was feeling to have to stay with the only leaders and helpers that I had known from a young age. And he encouraged me to seek out knowledge and wisdom from other people, from other healers, from other traditional people, because he helped me realize that along this long educational journey, this long path, as a Anishnaabe, that we don't ever learn everything. We can't possibly know everything in our lifetime, but we inspire to learn as much as we possibly can, and we can only do that when we access the wisdom and knowledge from many different people. So that changed my life, and so I went off on this new journey, talking to new people, finding out new stuff, learning more about who I was, not just as one of the original characters, but also as a spirit person. And I did that without any kind of heaviness or burden that I was betraying anybody. But I had also learned that there were other ways that we can learn specific things that could help us as Indigenous people. And many of those lessons would come not only from Indigenous people, but they came from non-Indigenous people. So this was a point in my life where I was moving out of the house. I was around 17 years old, and I was moving into London and Ontario to go to college. And I remember leaving on corner of Park Street and Dundas Street in London. And I was so excited as this young Indigenous dude living in a big urban center, going to set up a bank account in downtown London, Ontario. And at that point, London was a massive city compared to the community that I came from. It was big. I was living back home on a res with a community of no more than 1,000 people at that time. So moving into the city of London was a real big. I remember going down to the lessons that my parents and that my relatives have always taught me. And one of those was about the respect that we would have for our elders and for our women. And so walking into that bank, I noticed behind me that there was this non-Indigenous woman, and she was obviously coming from a place of wealth. She had this long fur coat on, and as I opened up that door, she made a remark to me, which was my very first real experience of racism and discrimination. And she said to me, "I don't need the likes of you opening up the door for me." And I looked at her baffled, but I was also 17 years old, so I was really trying to carve out my own space in the world. And I thought, well, if you're not going to respect me respecting you, then I'm not going to respect you. That so and I had learned that at that point there were going to be so many different levels and so many different kinds of racism and discrimination that I was going to face as an Indigenous person, as an Anishnaabe Ojokwe Indigenous queer as well. And that was the first one that really helped carve out who I am and the things that I needed to do in order to live up to my roles and responsibilities as an Indigenous person. And then I realized in years later that there were also times where at that particular time that there were a lot of jokes and comments that were being made about Indigenous people that were normalized at that point in time. So hearing some or seeing some of those jokes, such as things as cartoons and newspapers about Indigenous people, that it became normalized and that we had become so um, assimilated into a system that we in part were accepting of these forms of racism and discrimination, as subtle as they would be, and that it was and that we weren't doing anything about it, and that there was this legacy of history in Canada to treat us this way, to dehumanize us, and that it was okay for people to make fun of us. And later we would learn that, particularly when we started to scratch the surface of realize that while all the little Indian kids were in these schools being taught that they were no good, that they were savages, that they were pagans, that they were less than other members in society, that they were learning this form of education in Canadian Indian residential schools, we must also be aware what mainstream Canadians were learning in schools at that same time. And they were learning very, very much the same. They were learning that were less dehumanized, that we were supplement to any other race, and that it was normalized and it was okay to treat us in behaviors that would be associated to dehumanizing us as Indigenous people. So we have this legacy of education that we're dealing with now in 2021. That we're not only educating ourselves, and we've been able to pull ourselves out of the harm that had been done through that, only that one specific form of genocide, but recognizing that Canadians, all of Canadians, need to do the same work that we're doing. We're relearning, we're rebirthing ourselves, and they need to rebirth themselves and understand who we are. We have learned their way also not just our responsibility, it's a shared responsibility with Indigenous people. So I am hearing that the connection is very poor, and sadly, there isn't. I am connected by a cord, not by Wi-Fi. So I'm wondering if maybe it's a very bad connection in general, unfortunately, because I do see that increasing there. And sadly, I don't know what there is that I might be able to do with that.
I think what we'll do is just carry on. Just carry on, and then if it keeps coming, I'll let you know, and then maybe just remove yourself from the video, because sometimes it's streaming, and this time of day can be challenging. It's first thing in the morning, but it's wonderful what you're sharing. So keep going, and then we can always redo it.
I'm recognizing as well that I'm also living in an area where they're building a new school, and I have a school right across the road from me, so everything as well is virtual.
Yep. It's virtual and frozen. Let's just see. He may have to. I'm going to ask him to.
So it's quite a crazy journey here.
Maybe what you could do, Lyndon, just for a minute is remove yourself from the room and try to re-enter. Sometimes it's that original connection. So exit, and then we'll wait here. I'll wait here for a minute, and then.
Oh, perfect. Okay. So
yeah,
what I do
that.
is I'm gonna completely leave the studio.
Yes.
And then I'm gonna come right back.
Yes. Okay. That sounds great.
We'll do that.
Thank you.
All right. I'll see you in a second.
Okay. Hi, everyone. This week we have some more amazing guest speakers. Actually, might as well take this minute to remind you that Jane Burning will be with us this evening at 6 p.m. and she's amazing. If you haven't had time to spend time with her, she is just so wonderful, powerful in the teaching, and I guess, just kind of empowering or igniting a person to be able to get really deep inside themselves and healing themselves. And then we also have Dr. Mike Dockstader and grandmother Renee Thomas Hill tomorrow. So that's really exciting. And then next week we also have Tala Tatusis and Isaac Murdoch with us. So yeah, I'm really excited. Okay, it does seem a little bit better, but let's give it a try. And then what I'll do, Lyndon, I'll just, we'll just wing it. Let's just see what happens.
We're just gonna wing it. That's okay. We've been winging it through life for thousands of years. Yeah,
right? Right? Awesome. I just want to let you know this is super. Thanks everyone for staying with us.
Absolutely. So one of the other things that what's really exciting to know is that we have this whole new generation of people, Indigenous people specifically, who have become educated and who are learning not only our ways as Indigenous people, but are learning the colonizers' way. And so with that, with that combined knowledge forms of abuse. But also with the non-Indigenous people and the new generation, they're learning about our history. They're learning about the forms of genocide that have happened with Indigenous people, and they're learning about human rights of Indigenous people. So there's so much that in the future and now that is happening that's so positive and so exciting, such as virtual teaching and learning that in my lifetime in my journey, I've been so fortunate to be able to experience so many things. And I know that in this particular time with the pandemic, it can be very difficult to try and work through this, dependent on wanting to be around people and working with people. And this pandemic has pushed us into a spot where we're not getting that interaction with one another. and it's been difficult. So how I've chosen to look at this pandemic is to look at the privilege that I have of being able to experience living through pandemic and realizing that there are many generations who have not been afforded the opportunity to live through a pandemic. And for instance, like my mom and dad were never able to experience life through a pandemic. So I'm grateful for this opportunity that I have to be able to be experiencing the resilience of Indigenous people, my own resilience, and the resilience of everyone. And through this pandemic and many other experiences, we are learning so much. So I'm learning so much about myself and what I'm capable of doing through this pandemic because I'm spending so much time by myself. I've learned that I'm an incredible, my daughter is not as exciting as she wants me to be, but um, I'm going to I'm going to slip off the cam and see if that might work better because we seem to be going in and out. Can you still hear me?
I can see you and hear you. Did you do stop cam?
Yeah, I stopped the cam and then I think I started it back up again. Did I?
Oh, I don't know. Just look at the bottom and see it says stop cam and mute.
Oh yeah, okay.
That's my
Yes,
stop cam.
okay,
Okay,
there's
there
my
we go.
stop cam. Okay. So maybe that will help them. Maybe I'll
Hey, Lyndon, just go ahead and put your cam on. I'd rather look at you trying to do this. We might have to reschedule a time for this, maybe in a better time of day. It's really cutting out, and I don't know that people are staying on to watch. But you know what? Let's just do it. And we'll refilm this, okay? And then I'll play it later. So go
I'll tell
ahead,
you
keep
what
it
I
going.
will do is
Paula's telling us to be patient. It picks up where you left off, so.
I will. Okay, I'm going to reboot the internet, which will only take a couple of seconds, and I'll be right back.
Okay, cool. All right, Paula, we're gonna take your advice and we're going to hold off. We're just gonna wait and be patient, like Paula said. Christine, you're saying that you have no sound. Same thing. I think that maybe you might have to either reboot and join again, but there's a lot of I think if you, even on my end, there's some breaking up happening. So I think I'm just going to I'm going to wing it right now and try to figure out what else we can tell you, because I shared already what we are doing with this week. We have our guest speakers. We actually just received notice today that Duke Redbird will be joining us I think the week of March 22nd. He's having his 82nd birthday next week, or 2 weeks. And so he'll be joining us to read some of his beautiful poetry. And I don't know if any of you have ever heard Duke Redbird's poetry, but it's so beautiful. I met him the first time maybe about 4 years ago now, 3 years ago, and he is quite the story, and he's amazing. Oh, he's your uncle, Natasha? That's awesome. Well, I'm so happy to say that he'll be joining us and sharing his beautiful poetry, and he's just so cool. And your Aunt Nancy is pretty cool too. I've been talking with her. Yeah, so we're so excited. And then we have Drew Hayden, the comedy, or what do you call them? Comedic? What do you call them? I don't know. I'm stuck here. I was really not expecting this. But anyway, yeah. And so we also have some paint nights coming up that we'll be doing with Moses Linham again. He's going to be showing up. And that's always fun day. And you can prepare yourself by getting some paints. And oh, here comes Lyndon. Thank goodness. Hey,
Let's see if that's any better. I've rebooted the whole system, and I know that they're working diligently on the school across the street, and power is flickering off and on, and there's many kids across the street who are using probably the same wires of connection. I'm not sure, but let's hope that this works better.
Yeah, okay, let's go. Take it away.
Awesome.
Nice to see you again.
Perfectly. So I've learned so many different things over the years from so many different people, and I've been very fortunate in able to be provided these experiences. And I remembered when I had moved into London, besides that form of racism and discrimination, I was also afforded an opportunity to learn about homophobia and how the ugly face of homophobia, what it looks like in mainstream community. So I was working at London House Sciences as a porter, as an orderly. And I was working specifically at the Veterans Hospital, and I had such a magnificent time of learning at the Veterans Hospital, learning from the elders from other cultures about what it was like to have experienced life during the war. And there were these two gentlemen in particular who were fond of each other and that they had an intimate relationship. And quite often in the middle of the night, the two gentlemen would find space together either in one room or another. That would present was horrible. And how staff would treat them when they would be found. They would drag them into the shower room and hose them down with cold water and separate them. And so that those forms of homophobia that I experienced through that were reason enough to engage, openly be two-spirit in the community because of the persecution that was happening still for two-spirit people. And then so I had learned that I had to be very discreet about who I was, and in some cases, still be closeted. So I was out of the closet to my family, but I wasn't out of the closet to the world per se. And it was also through the same institution that I had to learn, and the battle between who I was as an Indigenous person and my job. So what I mean by that was this: if you remember on Tuesday, I talked about how important my family was, how important my grandmother and grandpa, sadly. Oh no, really bad connection, sadly. So anyway, I will continue. So with my work profession, my grandmother got really sick, and my family had called me in Sarnia, the hospital where my grandmother was. Okay, is this going to work now? Is there an interaction happening, a spiritual intervention happening with the Wi-Fi today? So when my grandmother got very sick, she was a hospital in Sarnia. My family contacted me and said, you need to here. Grandmother is spoke with my supervisor at the hospital, and I told her my grandmother is not well and I've been called home. And she said to me, if you do not show up for your shift, you can consider yourself fired. And instantly, I remembered all the teachings that I have had. And so I told the supervisor that you could take the job and you could nicely place it where the sun, moon, and stars do not shine, because my family is the most important thing. Sadly, that argument with her took a couple of hours, and by the time I started her journey, that was a significant teaching for me early in my life, realizing that at no cost would I ever let anything interfere or come between me and my family. That my family was going to be the most important thing because they were always there for me. I remember reading somewhere, if you applied a glossy lip balm to your lips, that it makes you look 10 years younger. So I'm reapplying the glossy lip balm to my lips because I'm thinking now maybe I look maybe about 15 or 16 years old. No, my lips are very dry and I need my pointers to be working like that. There we go. I think you're on mute. Oh, okay.
I'm totally
Yeah,
on mute.
okay. I noticed that this seems to be working better than when you put me on the big screen. We seem to have a lot of, oh, but even then it's still, I don't know. I don't know whether it's your
I don't know what
connection
it
or
is.
mine. I'm not sure, but one of them's not working. But yeah, so I read that several years ago in an article that if you put shiny lip balm on your lips, that it makes you appear younger. But it's very dry in my home, so I have to keep reconditioning my. They're very important for me in this journey that family, and we have to sometimes walk away from family when they bring us harm. And I remember another experience that I had. So in my lifetime, I've always worked with Indigenous people, and they help shape the work that I do now. On my reserve, I worked in the child welfare program.
I was just messaging everyone, asking if for the techie people, what if he hotspots or something? I don't know. I'm not a techie person. I'm just thinking that if Lyndon tries to go from his phone data, is that possible? I'm not really sure, but thank you all for bearing with us. I think what we might end up doing is rescheduling his talk because he's just magnificent in everything that he does. And we're definitely going to reschedule this because it's not fair that we have all had to kind of bear through this and hang on every static and breakup in the conversation. So what I'll do is I will message Lyndon and see if he can hop back on and see if he is still having trouble on his end. Excuse me while I do this. Thanks for holding on. Lyndon's going to try to jump back on, at least to see if the connection is better. And if it's not better, then we will reschedule his talk for a time that that would work better after we figure out the issues that he's having. But I thought I'd kind of come on here and talk about how wonderful the last few weeks have been. Actually, it's been about a month since the middle of January, and the work that we've done here at Grandmother's Voice and in our community. And there's been some conversations. We started this movement because for myself, living in Halton as an urban Indigenous woman, there was never really support set up in this community. And I think this is all around Ontario and maybe even across our nation, where there's people like myself that have had to look into their own Indigenous culture, history, genealogy, to try to find the connection to their roots. And so this is how Grandmother's Voice began with my cousin grandmother Renee Thomas Hill. We are fourth cousins, and when I met her, she actually said, I've been waiting for you. And this was after about a 15-year journey of me doing within my life, doing my genealogy and research and going through census forms and just trying to find my family's history. My father, grandmother, and great-grandmother had all committed suicide. So that led me to, hey, Lyndon, I'm just telling a little bit of a story, see if you can get settled there. But anyway, so it led us, Renee and I, to talk about what our purpose was, finding each other, because we were, it'd been so many years. And when I met her, she told me that I was the final woman or female person to come back into the lineage to complete the matriarchal lineage of our family genealogy. And so that was really powerful when she said that to me. And this is where Grandmother's Voice started from, because I had said to her, I started a blog like 8 years ago, that was grandmother's voice, because I found myself writing, when I was writing my story, my grandmother was sitting beside me, and, and I wasn't really sure that that was real, because I hadn't, discovered or looked into the spiritual side of, the understanding of, is this real, that somebody could be telling me all of this stuff right here and not be here physically? And so when I shared this with her, that, I had this story in grandmother's voice, and she kept telling me that this is what we're supposed to do. And now I'm with her. I was with Renee, and I was saying to her, like, oh my God, like, this is real now. This is real. You're here, and you're everything that was in my dream that this woman at the table was telling me I was going to find. This is, what do we do now? And Renee said, well, we keep doing what we're doing, and, let's create what we're supposed to create together. And this really came from the conversations that myself, her, and Gail Whitlow talked about, what it means to be able to bring people together to create that healing and this time. Like Lyndon, you were saying earlier, we are in a really special time, and we're just carrying on from, years ago when it was like ignited. So anyway, I appreciate that time that I was given to put that little morsel in there about our story and where grandmother's voice is, and bringing community together, so that people like me in urban communities can really continue their journey and connect to the culture. And even if they can't find their family like I did, you can connect to yourself and spirit and the creator, and it will come, and understanding will come. So let's see what's going on here, Lyndon. Let's see if the connection's better.
Absolutely.
Take it away.
I think it's much better now, Jody. I
Yep.
shut off the Wi-Fi and stuff. Can you hear me okay?
You just have to come closer or bring it closer to, because of the sound isn't that well. I don't know if your microphone is blocked by what's maybe holding it. Oh, it sounds like it's better. Let's see. Say something.
Is that better? Can you hear
It's a little better. Your sound is.
How's that? A little better?
No, I don't know why. I don't know why it's not loud.
How about now?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay.
So it must be where your microphone is on your phone.
Yeah, it's the way the microphone is.
Oh, that's better. That's so much better.
Okay, so I'm just gonna have to hang on to it then and hope I don't hit the leave button.
You might sit like this. Sit like this.
I might get a little cramped here. But that's okay. It's okay. So yeah, I was just talking. I was starting to talk about where I picked up a lot of my different lessons, and one of the lessons that I had learned about differences in values, beliefs, morals with Indigenous people versus non-Indigenous people came from when I worked in the child prevention services back home in my community. So one particular day, there was a CAS worker, and I'd worked with this magnificent family from the community for many years. And then one particular day, one of the CAS workers came down to the community, and she was going to apprehend the four children of this single mom. And mom had become single because her husband had died, so she was widowed. And she was a magnificent mom and carried many different gifts that were not just specific for her family, but our community and our nation. And I knew that this was an arranged visit. And so mom had spent a lot of time preparing her home the way that we would do when we have guests coming. So she cleaned her house up, and it was just spick and span, and it was a beautiful home. And then the worker showed up, and it was a rainy day. And the worker walked through her home, walked into the home, and walked through her home with her muddy boots on, the CAS worker. And when she noticed that there wasn't any subflooring in the living room, she was agitated. And for her, that from mom. And I was furious. And so I told the worker that first, I knew that mom had spent a significant amount of time preparing for her arrival today, and that the fact that there was not subflooring on the floor wasn't enough reason to apprehend her children and that she needed to get off our reserve. So I chased her out of there. I chased her out of mom's home and I chased her off the reserve. And so that taught me about how there's the magnificent difference between values and beliefs for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, that caring for a child is not dependent on what you have on your floors. And so I didn't really like working in the child welfare system at that point, and it was difficult working in my own community because at that particular time there was still a lot of homophobia that was happening in the community. So I left that job and I went to work specifically with the Children's Aid Society outside of the community. And when I went to work outside the community in a child welfare system, that was my first experience of tokenism. In that an agency wanted to build a space that was Indigenous specific, but we weren't able to create our own policies and procedures. We were still having to adhere to a foreign culture's set of beliefs, values, and morals, and all within a colonial legal system that was never built to benefit Indigenous people, but rather to assist in the process of assimilation or genocide of Indigenous people. And so the system, we found ourselves, there were 5 or 6 of us on this Indigenous specific child welfare team, and very limited, very restrained with the things that we could do. So I quickly learned that we were part of a process of tokenism, that it looked good for this particular non-Indigenous agency to have an Indigenous team, but we weren't able to do the things that we really needed to do. It was a conflict between my roles and traditional Indigenous roles and responsibilities and professionalism. So they were constantly in conflict. And I remember the reason that I left that job was because in that specific role, I was working with young teenagers, Indigenous teenagers and their families. And I watched parents struggle trying to maneuver through the non-Indigenous child welfare system, that it's felt like and looked like that system was constantly building walls for our people. And the legacy of harm that had been done to Indigenous people was manifesting itself, the trauma was manifesting itself in many of the people that I was working with in very abusive ways, abusing themselves and allowing abuse to happen to them from others. And it was really hard to watch that abuse. And my final day with that system was a day that I was called to go and help two young Indigenous boys and their sister. And I remember pulling up to that home and the kids come running out and they were screaming and crying. And they were just barely teenagers at that point. And when they started to tell me what had happened to them, to the abuse that had just been inflicted on them, the sexual assault that had happened from family members, that triggered me to my own abuse. And I realized that I still needed work. I needed to work on myself. So I had to leave that system. But I had learned that foreign systems weren't working for Indigenous people, and that we needed to start developing space and creating time for us to look at what our own systems and how we incorporate our own beliefs and morals into all the work that we needed to do. But also acknowledging that homophobia was still going crazy in all of our communities, and there was this heavy inequity and unfairness that was happening for Two-Spirit people. I was raised in my community, and from a very young age, I was a protester. I was a protector. I grew up. My father was from Stony Point, who Ipperwash crisis, the Dudley George crisis. That is my family. And so I grew up with my dad and relatives constantly walking up and down Highway 21 with a placard with a sign, "Give us our land back. We want to move home." And so I grew up fighting and battling for Anishnaabe people, for our people in our community. And then when I had finally come out of the closet, there was another fight that I had to take on, and that was I needed to see fairness and I needed to see equality for two-spirited people, for the queer nation, for Indigenous queer. And so when I was living in London, I had a partner who worked at the University of Western Ontario, and one day we were talking about benefits, um, the spousal benefits that were being afforded to heterosexual couples, and that we felt that it was very unfair that we were not being able to access those same benefits. So we decided to fight against the university and fight for those same sex spousal benefits, and eventually we won those. So my lifetime has felt like this constant battle of equality and recognition, and to have the voices heard of myself as an Indigenous person, but also myself as a two-spirit person. And one of the things that had always bothered me with Indigenous and non-Indigenous ways of life here in Canada is, while we were on this path to wanting to create space for the equality of Indigenous people here, I had always found it so difficult to understand why every other culture that had moved here from other spaces of this sphere, they were having unions, they were getting married here, and our levels of government were recognizing their unions. But why were they not recognizing our unions? And I used to think that perhaps one of the reasons they weren't recognizing Indigenous unions is because historically, within most of our nations, two people of the same gender could have a union, could be married, and that was acceptable for all time with Indigenous communities. So I thought maybe that was part of why they wouldn't recognize Indigenous unions, because we had always had that history. Now, just recently, we are accepted within the last 6 months, I believe, that Indigenous leaders in our communities, elders, helpers, can have a traditional union, and it is now recognized. But I had also come to realize, as many of my teachers and friends have told me, that it doesn't really matter what the government thinks, that it's between the people and the community, that when a union happens, it happens. And as long as as long as the two people having the union and their family and their community and their nation recognizes it, it doesn't matter what the levels of government say. And that's more important to me. I remembered along my journey that I had taken a job that had me working in the jails, the penitentiaries in and around Kingston and Bath and Millhaven. And the experiences that I had there and the relatives that I met in the institutions. But I had always felt that one of the safest spaces for me along my journey was always inside those institutions with the brotherhoods and the sisterhoods. Because outside of the institutions was such an ugly place for two-spirited people, with the homophobia and the rejection from family, from loved ones, from communities, the rejection from ceremonies, from our way of life. It was crippling. As we walk our journey, for me, it was crippling. And that rejection was constant. It came from family, it came from friends, it came from elders, it came from teachers, it came from people who were supposed to have roles and responsibilities to provide to me. But in the institutions, the brotherhoods and the sisterhoods made me feel welcome, and they protected me, and they made me feel safe. So I loved working in the institutions. And then as well, and about our responsibilities to each other. And one of the things that I had learned in the institution was how difficult it was to maneuver around federal legislation and provincial legislation around access to traditional knowledge, to traditional medicines, our way of life. So I was bringing in some elders and some teachers for our brothers and sisters, our forgotten population, I often refer to them by, because that's often what they referred to themselves by. That once they got into the institution, most Indigenous people forgot about our relatives behind those walls. That bothered me, that there was a forgotten population, because most of our brothers and sisters behind in those institutions behind those walls were coming home one day, and that we should not ever neglect them. And but the things that I had learned in those institutions, I was bringing in elders and helpers for the brothers and the sisters in the institution to access their wisdom, knowledge, and their help. And one day we were in line. I had a grandmother coming in to assist the brotherhood at Joyceville Institution. And I remember she had her bundle with her, and she was bringing in her gifts of knowledge and medicine to share with uh, the brothers in the institution. And we were stopped by security, and the grandmother was strip searched, and she was taken off to the side and strip searched, and her medicines taken. Everybody who was standing in a lineup. And I was so angered with what was happening to her because of my teachings about respect for women and respect for elders, and that they didn't even have the decency to take her behind a wall before they started looking under her skirt and under her blouse. But I witnessed behind me that there were individuals from an organized religion who were carrying boxes and bags, and they were freely let in to have access into the institution. So that really angered me because I was seeing further the racism and discrimination that was happening in these institutions on Indigenous people. But then it became very difficult for me to get our ways of life into the institution. It became difficult for me to get medicines in and bring them into the brotherhood. So I brought a grandmother up who was living in Toronto. And at 4:15 in the morning on one day, she had messaged me and called me and said, "Come and pick me up. I have to go to the water." And I looked at the time and I thought, holy heck, it's 4:15 in the morning. Nobody's at the water. But as I'd learned, when our elders and our helpers ask for something, we don't question. There's something that she needed to do. So I got ready and I went and picked her up. And she asked me to take her down to the water. So I took her down to the water, and because it was dark, I had the headlights on her so that I could make sure she was safe. And I watched her walk down to the water, and I watched her as she hiked up her skirt a little bit, walked a little bit into the water, and then I could see that she was clearly talking to somebody or something, and that she knelt down and she put her hands on top of the water, and she started to wash that water all over her body. And then she came back to the car and she said, "Come down here. I need to teach you this ceremony." So she took me down to the water and she taught me a water ceremony. And when we were done that ceremony, she said to me, "This ceremony is usually known for Anishnaabe Ojokwe, for Indigenous women. But because you carry the masculine and feminine spirits, this too is your ceremony. And I've watched as you struggled to take teachings and medicines into our brothers and sisters behind the walls. And you won't have to struggle any longer, because no matter where you go around here, you will always have access to water. And so this is your ceremony and your medicine to share with our brothers and sisters. And after the days were spent together and we spent that time together, how empowering it was that this was one of the very first teachings that was given to me by an elder and was gifted to me with purpose and with such strength and such knowledge that I felt so empowered carrying this around with me. And after our time had been spent over a couple of days, I was at home living in Kingston, and I started to think about my mom and all of these things that my mom should have been able to give to me, such as that water ceremony. And I was reminded of when we were kids growing up back home. My mom would put us into the car and we'd go down to the beach. And before we would get out the car, my mom would go to the water first. And I was reminded by watching the elder in Kingston going down to the water, I was reminded of what my mother was doing when we were going to the beach. So my mom would go get out the car and she would go to the beach, and I would watch her. She'd walk into the water and she would put her hands on the water and she would wash herself, rub that water over her body. And years later, I would ask her, "What is it that you were doing? I remember you were doing this." And she said that she had remembered her mother. My mom grew up along the river on Sarnia Reserve, the St. Clair River. And quite often, my grandmother, my mom's mom, would go to the water and she would do the ceremony. And my mom said when she would take us to the water to go play and to go swim, she would go first and she'd have a conversation with the water, because something made her remember that this was part of her responsibility, that this was a ceremony that she had. And so she said that she had a conversation with the water, and the first thing that she did was respect the water and acknowledge the power that water had. And that water had the power to take life. And the conversation that my mom would have with the water is that, "Please spare my children. They're coming in to meet you and greet you and play. And spare my children. Don't take their life." And so it had come full circle, the ceremony, that my grandmother had given it to my mom from memory. And my mother carried part of that ceremony, but it was gifted to me through another Anishnaabe Ojokwe. And so Two Spirit people carry these ceremonies, both masculine and feminine. And so I was able to give that ceremony and those teachings back to our brothers and sisters. And also in the same area where I was living in Kingston, because I was having such a difficult time getting teachings and getting medicines into the institutions, I would go back home and meet with some of the helpers back in Kettle Point. And I had learned that two of my spiritual helpers, one was the white birch and one was a spider. The spider, oddly, being something that I'm absolutely terrified by, but the spider had many teachings for me, which is a whole different speak about the spiders and the web of the spiders. But while I was in Kingston, I was also gifted another ceremony that engaged water, and that was a tiny a feast ceremony for those that grieve a lost. And the use in making a white birch little basket that would hold the feast goods. And I was told that that also was an old Indigenous women's teaching that was gifted to me. So I have used and shared that teaching with many of our brothers and sisters over the years. So my journey has been one where I've been picking up these ceremonies and these gifts for our people over time and over space. And through that same position, I was afforded an opportunity to spend much time with many Indigenous people from across the province. And one of our roles and responsibilities at that time was to go into the institutions and to meet with the Indigenous liaison officers, but also to meet with the elders and the healers who were also coming in to provide teachings with the brothers and sisters. So we were doing this education, we were building this harm reduction from an Indigenous perspective. And harm reduction, basically in the simplest forms, is reducing harm. How do we reduce harm for our brothers and sisters who might be engaged in some substance use of some kind or some other behaviors? How do we assist them along their journey without judgment? And so we were developing this program, and part of the program was that we also had to teach about Two-Spirit people and the history of Two-Spirit people and the legacy of harm on Two-Spirit people and Indigenous people in Canada and the United States on Turtle Island. And so while we were doing this teaching, we had elders who possessed the knowledge of Two-Spirit people who came to provide the teachings with us amongst their peers, amongst other elders and traditional helpers. And it was discouraging, to say the least, the homophobia that came from our traditional leadership, our traditional helpers, those that call themselves elders or healers in our community, many of the visionaries, many of the healers, many of our wise ones, and the homophobia that came from them, and the abuse that came from their lips onto the elders who were helping us deliver this knowledge, share this wisdom with them, that would happen. And so that session ended quickly because it ended up being not healthy for anybody. And I was very discouraged with that because these are the people in our community who are carrying the knowledge. But I had learned that as well, that we can't hold grudges, or we can't hold any hate towards any Indigenous person, because I had to remember that we're all affected by the legacy of harm done by colonization, and that many of the folks in that room that we were engaged with hadn't learned about Two-Spirit people either, and that the journey that I was on to learn about who I was, they hadn't been on that journey yet. So right after, interestingly though, the bigger lesson came afterwards. After that whole harmful scenario had happened within the institution, with our teachers and our elders, we had to go to one of North America's biggest powwows, which was held at the Rogers Stadium in Toronto. And so we had a booth there where we were talking about harm reduction, talking about things like HIV and AIDS and other sexually transmitted disease, and talking about Two-Spirit people, our roles and responsibilities, and the history of Two-Spirit people. And myself and my boss and a couple of my colleagues had gone up to lunchtime to get a bite to eat. And one of those elders who was in that training session approached me, and he wanted me to go back to his room. He had a room close by, and he invited me back to his room as a Two-Spirit person. And by the invitation that he was making, I knew that the invitation was sexual in nature. What I had quickly learned was I felt sad for this elder, for this wise one, because I realized that this legacy, this harm on Two-Spirit people, this ugly, dark shroud of homophobia, had made made him live a life of being positive and probably not being happy. And that he, perhaps the only thing that he knew about being two-spirit was the only thing that would engage sexual activity. And I felt really bad for him because he was very abusive in language in the educational sessions that were happening just days before. But he was positive. And so I hope somewhere along his journey that he has found who he is and has found a good walk and a good life and that he is happy. But that taught me lots about what we don't know about ourselves as two-spirit people. So those were wonderful experiences for us. And so over time, I would represent myself as two-spirit. I remember the first time that I wore a ceremonial skirt back home. And I was really nervous to do that because it's one thing to come out to family, and then you get family support and you feel their love. It's a totally different thing to come out to community, to come out to the world. And so the first time that I wore a ribbon skirt back home to ceremony, I was really nervous. I was nervous about the harm that could be done. And much to my surprise, there was not even an eyelid batted. That people really just figured that at some point in time they were going to see this and that this was important for them to see and it was important for me to do. So there was no drama. It just happened and it felt like it was just meant to be. It was really comfortable and it was welcoming. And sometimes I feel that we walk along this life, we walk along our journey, and we ask ourselves, are we making any real big change with all the work that we are doing? And a couple years ago, I had an answer to that question for myself about feeling I was starting to feel like I was really putting myself out there. This came after with my good friend that I was engaged with, I don't know more, Micah Burning. She had asked me also to help her to organize and create one of Turtle Islands, or one of Canada's first Indigenous pride within Indigenous territory. And that was on Six Nations community here outside of Brantford, Ontario. And so I helped her with that, but it was very difficult because when we started to advertise and be public about the creation and the event of Six Nations Pride going to happen, homophobia started to surface, and there were threats, physical threats, that were happening to some of us in that group, to the amount and the extent that we had to make a very conscious decision and know that we were putting our own personal safety at risk. But when you reach this point in your life where you know that you have to do these things and you examine historically how many other people, Indigenous people, have taken steps to put themselves at risk, it was a risk that I was willing to take because I was tired of two spirit voices. Uh, I was tired of doors being closed on us. I was tired of our voices not being heard. And Six Nations is the largest Indigenous community in Canada. And this was really important for the young people who were struggling and who were faced with violence due to homophobia. So I knew it was important. So we went ahead with it. But sometimes you stop and have to ask yourself the question, is all of this worth it? Is it making change? And that answer came from me when I lost a relative back home. And I was called home when one of my relatives was murdered. And so I pulled up on the road and I parked on the side of the road to a relative's home back on my res. And I was walking down the driveway. I was greeted by an extended family member, by a sibling. Uh, and I was told that a sibling by Indigenous family construct. And I was asked to prepare my two spiritedness to come and help the women in our family prepare the medicines that were going to be used for the days that followed in helping our loved one start their new journey, their spiritual journey. So I walked around back of the house, and the women of this loved one were preparing the cedar, and I sat down with them. And naturally, organically, it just happened that we sat together and we prepared those medicines and we got them ready in acknowledgement of our loved one who was going to start the journey. And that was such a beautiful feeling, because then I had realized that all the work that we have done as Two Spirit people brought us to this day. And even more beautiful at that time was one of my sister's young sons came and approached and asked if he could participate in helping with the medicines. And as it unfolded organically, the teaching of Two Spirit people and the roles and responsibilities of Two Spirit people came as a teaching to this young man. And it was confirmed that all the work that we do as Two Spirit people is making a difference. And change is happening. And that we have to keep doing the work that we're doing, because it's influencing this bigger change, and that we have to accept our roles and responsibilities. We have to pick up our bundles and let these things happen. Incidentally, this was also the family. For many years in southwestern Ontario, the homophobia led to things such as Two Spirit people, we were not allowed to participate in ceremonies. So we weren't allowed in lodges, we weren't allowed to do many things. And having talked about that frustration and that denial, and to have an access to such things as participating as Two Spirit in grand entries at powwows, being denied access into sweat lodges or into other ceremonies, led to a conversation of my brother Sam George. And he felt and witnessed the pain that Two Spirit people, that I was experiencing from being excluded from these teachings. So for the first time in many years in southwestern Ontario, Sam George created space and created time for me at his direction to invite Two Spirit people to his home, where he would teach Two Spirit people how to go out and collect saplings, how to prepare a teaching lodge, how to build a teaching lodge, how to build and prepare a sweat lodge. And he did this with such an open heart and mind, and a loving heart and loving mind, that it was beautiful to see that the space was being created for Two Spirit people. It was that family that again had asked that I help prepare these medicines. So we're seeing these things happen. They feel like they're slow sometimes, but it's purposeful. Because right across Turtle Island, if you look and you think about all of the leadership and all the magnificent people doing incredible things, you will see a big representation of Two Spirit people, because we have learned to pick up our bundles, to pick up our teachings, to pick up our medicines, and reclaim that space. And so we're seeing right across in many areas where Indigenous people and Two Spirit people are picking up our bundles and reclaiming that space. And we're having to claim space so that we can create our own narratives, because the narratives that have been done by non-Indigenous people aren't always the true narratives of who we are as Indigenous people. So some of the work that I've done, Sherry yesterday, our grandmother Sherry, talked about the I Am Affected campaign on Tuesday, rather. And she talked about how that campaign provided space. And that was part of the purpose, one of the purposes of that campaign, that myself and many wonderful colleagues and friends and relatives, we created that. And we created it because we knew that we had to create space for Indigenous people to start sharing their stories. We needed to create time where Indigenous people could start talking about things such as how they were feeling about Canadian Indian residential schools, talk about their intergenerational trauma, how we needed to create space to have open dialogue about murdered and missing Indigenous women, trans identifying girls, how we needed to talk about murdered and missing Indigenous men and boys, how we needed to create space to talk about suicide, to talk about discrimination, racism, homelessness. And we needed to hear it from our perspective. We needed to create our narratives before somebody else continued to start creating a narrative that was not true to how we were feeling or that was the truth about our journeys. So that campaign, which has traveled in some areas, other areas of the province, was created to build that space and to create that time for Indigenous people to start telling our stories. And that is part of what I've been trying to do over Tuesday and today for you, is to start telling my narrative and sharing my story so that wisdom and knowledge that you carry, and when you pick up and gather your bundle, you'll understand more now about the path of a one, two-spirited person who had grew up and was born in my Indigenous community on my reserve, what that looked like, the role that homophobia played in my life, the role that intergenerational trauma has played in my life. And hopefully that many other people will take a look at how we need to create space and create the time for more two-spirit people to encourage and foster the roles of our two-spirit young people at a very young age, rather than waiting until we're teenagers or we're adults, that we return back to our way of being, our way of life, and we nurture those spiritual roles at a very, very young age, and that we continue to fight stigma and discrimination on things such as um, two-spirit people, and we continue to fight against all of the norms that were pushed on us as Indigenous people that are not conducive to our way of life. So I think in all the work that I've done living on and off the reserve, it's helped me to deliver and provide and reach my roles and responsibilities as a two-spirit person, providing Indigenous people with a means to get the assistance that they do. Right now, I work as the Indigenous Justice Coordinator at the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic, where I help many of our brothers and sisters get the access to legal representation that they require. Even though it's a colonial legal system, we still have to have representation. So I seek out somebody who helps, who understands who we are as Indigenous people. And some of the other work that I do is I work actively on a Sisters in Spirit committee, because I remember one day walking out my door and thinking that I hated that Indigenous women and any one of my sisters should ever feel that they're part of a disposable population. That really bothered me, and I needed to be active. So I really helped push for the inquiry. And now we have those calls to justice that it is our responsibility to somehow incorporate those calls to justice in all the work that we do. And in those calls to justice are specifically mentioned two-spirit people and the roles that we can play in assisting in the delivery. It's important for me to look at the calls to action and help people understand what those mean. And even if reconciliation looks dim on a federal level, there's still areas of reconciliation that we can engage in on family levels, community levels, and various different levels. There's still a lot of work to do that many Indigenous people are doing. I work in a system of trying to create a better child welfare system, an Indigenous specific child welfare system, so our children are no longer taken from our homes. I'm helping and assisting to build and create an Indigenous Peoples Court that, although at first it's going to be reflective of, there's going to be a marriage between Indigenous legal principles and applications with the colonial legal system, but the vision is always going to be that we have our own restorative justice, that we use our own forms of legal principles and applications, and that we incorporate them into everything that we do. And so all of these things that we do together. I don't do any of this work on my own. I work with such a magnificent group of people, and it's always in consultation with the Indigenous community, because I remember that one of the most important things it is for an Indigenous person is that we have to be consulted on everything. We need to be part of the process. You can't bring us a finished product, throw it down in front of us and say, here, this is what we're going to do. Okay? No, it's not okay. We need to be part of the process. So I think in my closing statements that what I'd like to say is that let's continue to create the space. Let's continue to create time so that Indigenous voices continue to be heard, that we continue to write our own narratives as we move forward, and we continue to do the magnificent work that each and every one of you are doing for our communities. Keep on doing what you're doing. Keep on being awesome. Keep on being deadly. And we're going to get through all of this stuff, and our future is very bright. So Chimagwech for all the work that you're doing. Chimagwech for listening to me today.
Lyndon, you're amazing. With all of the, technical difficulties that we had, it's like it didn't even affect it. It didn't even affect, the depth of what you do and who you are is magnificent. That's kind of, I made some little notes here that the words that kind of describe you to me. And I just, Chimagwich for everything that you've shared in the last couple of days. And I see that I just feel like the work that we're going to do is going to continue. I'd like to take just a minute to acknowledge a couple of the things that you said that really resonated with the work that we're doing. And we really don't call it work. When we get together with the grandmothers and we're all sitting at that table, like you said, collectively sharing our gifts, because that's really what it is. When you sit at a table and everyone's bundle is there and you can acknowledge every single one of them for their gifts you see. They're not tangible in that moment, but it's like you feel what everyone can bring to the table. It's just beautiful. The point that you made about all affected by colonization. This is what I find is so wonderful about working with the people that we do and collaborating with the grandmothers and all of our wise ones, is that they don't just think as much as we are representing and caring for our Indigenous people. It's not just the Indigenous people. We're all one, and we're really trying to let everyone know that what we're here to do is to heal each other, ourselves. We can't really support anyone else's healing without healing ourselves, right? So so I just want to acknowledge that, mentioning that really resonated with me, because that's exactly what we're doing in our own communities here, is really trying to bring people together to heal this nation. And so and then also the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, two-spirited, like, we've been doing this work for several years. I have myself in the halting community in any way that I can. There's some amazing women, activist women in this area that have been here since the 80s. And they were a big part of bringing in that the Sisters in Spirit ceremonies with Paula Lang, who's at our Sheridan College. She did so much for igniting our Indigenous community here in Halton. And I'll acknowledge her until until I'm no longer here to do that. It was very powerful, the work that she did. And unfortunately it's just challenging, you know, when people are afraid to move forward because, you know, they might lose something, who knows what. We have to be conscious, and it's not, we're not doing this in a way that is telling them you're not allowed to have a say in what Indigenous people are doing. It's how, right? It's like what you said, bring us to the table. And if we acknowledge that, you know, hey, this is wonderful work that you're doing. However, like maybe it's not far enough. Maybe it's not really engaging the community. Maybe that, I think that where we are as a society right now is we're kind of we've moved past the, we're going to educate the settler people or our you know, our friends, family. We're actually need to create capacity for the people that are living here now, because it's been a long time, eh, Lyndon? Like, you know, this, when I say long time, too long that we, you know, and I love this quote, but I think people don't break it down enough when they say buy a book, read a book, right? These book clubs are about educate yourself and let the money really go to sustaining a sustainable program for our Indigenous people. That's what we've been advocating, or even not we, myself, as Jody Harbour, urban Indigenous woman in my community. That's what I've been saying for a long time, is we appreciate the space because the space has been held here, okay, for however, if it's being a nonprofit, bringing in Indigenous programming, trying to make awareness in the community. But there's a time, like right now, and that's what we're doing in Halton, is saying, you know, it's wonderful that you've held the space for us. We're so grateful, but we're going to have to do this work ourselves now, right? If we've just, it's time to just create it and let it happen. And the systems that have set up that you expect us to live in and be in, they don't exist for me. Me as an urban Indigenous entrepreneur, woman making space, caring about the coming faces, learning about my own bundle. This is what I have to do. And so thank you again so much. I'm inviting you to be a part of our Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls monument that we created actually last year. We'd love for you to be present and bring in your the council that you'd work with your sisters in spirit. And we started this monument last fall, and we wanted to create a living monument for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And our vision is to have this all across the province and even all across the nation. You know, what the grandmother said about these monuments is that we need something that's living for the families to go to, right? We want to acknowledge the women, but we need to acknowledge the family unit. And that, you know, and that could be in any way. So everyone will see more of that at our new space in Halton that's going to be coming out in the next couple of weeks. And we're just really, really pleased, Lyndon, that you've circled back into our community, because you've been here from the beginning, doing pieces here and there and supporting, trying to really bring our community together here. And it really is a true honor that you're here to support us in you know, creating safe space for our Indigenous community here. So I'm just really happy that you are here, and happy with the words that you shared. Makes my heart.
But it's been such a humbling experience as well, because over the last few years, I think when people think about the Halton region, when they think about Burlington and Oakville, they don't necessarily think that there's a significant Indigenous population in the region. But over the last few years, over the last 5 to 8 years for me, I have come acquainted with and have met so many Indigenous people in the region, and most are brothers and sisters who have been displaced. And when I talk about displaced, I'm talking about many of the Indigenous folks that I've met in the Halton region were babies when they were taken, and they were set somewhere else or given to another family. So there are relatives who were taken through things like the 60 scoop or crown warships, or somehow separated from their families and from their communities. And the energy that I feel from my relatives in the Halton region, like yourself and Sherry and many others, it's so strong. It's such a happy, strong energy that helps me keep interested in wanting to see more and more happening in the region, because I know historically as well in that area, that particular area from Burlington to Oakville and even into Mississauga, not so much Mississauga anymore, but there's been a huge lack of anything Indigenous in the area. And I know that many of the brothers and sisters that I've had contact with in the area, it's been difficult. So it's been such a blessing to see grandmother's voice. You're like this phoenix that's rising up out of the earth and bringing into the area what our people need that don't have the access or the capacity to get into a neighboring city. So thank you for all the work that you're doing. You also talked about something that was kind of baffling for me when I first heard it, and it's you kind of talked about reconciliation exhaustion. And so when the calls to action first came out and everybody was learning about those calls to action and what had happened in Canadian Indian residential schools, everybody wanted an Indian. Everybody wanted an Indigenous person on a committee, on a board, doing openings, doing closings. Then came the territorial acknowledgement. Everybody wanted an Indigenous person doing territorial acknowledgements, all of these things. And I was one of the people who got so exhausted in this process that I quickly started teaching our friends and allies that this is not our responsibility. Our responsibility has been to learn about who you are and your ways of life, whether we liked it or not. It was forced on us, most of us. It's your responsibility to learn about who we are now. We can't step aside outside of all the great things that we're doing right now to continue educating you. Use Google, pick up a book, go and talk to Indigenous people in your neighborhood. But we can't continue to be your educators because we're still learning ourselves. We're still unpacking all of the legacies of harm that have been brought upon us. We can't possibly be the educators to all of this because we're becoming exhausted. And I'm so pleased to see that so many of our brothers and sisters have also acknowledged that reconciliation exhaustion because, it's not our position. We shouldn't be the ones who are doing territorial acknowledgements. We've always known our roles and responsibilities on territory and land. We've known historically that if we're coming into Mi'kmaq territory or to Cree territory as Anishnaabe, that we're going to consult with the territorial occupants before we travel that land. That's our responsibility. It's not our responsibility to talk about the territorial acknowledgement. So it's important for us to remember that sometimes the battle is not ours, but there's a lot of work that we have to do in terms of reconciliation. And I've always felt that reconciliation needs to come within first, right? So that reconciliation of knowing who we are, where we come from, how we're connected, who we're going to connect with, who's the community that we're going to build. I had to leave my community during that ugly shroud of homophobia to come into an urban center to find and help build an Indigenous community where I'm not faced with as much homophobia as there was on my reserve. And so you build these other families as well when you're building an Indigenous community. And that's what's happening in Halton is you're building what, as I always call, an urban res, right? So in Hamilton we have an urban res. In Halton you've got an urban res going on, and it's people like you and yourself and Sherry and other magnificent people who are building our families through this process as well. So once again, thank you very much for all the work that you're doing, and I'm so excited that I'm going to be a part of it. I'm so excited and humbled still to be part of this process where you have so many magnificent people and influence like Isaac Murdoch. When I heard you say Isaac's name this morning, Isaac has been such an influential person for me in his teachings and his knowledge and everything. He provides translation services for us for Anishnaabe and just so many wonderful things that Isaac talked about that really hit home for me. and have been a power and a strength for me. And so being so humbled to be part of a series where Isaac is also speaking, where Dr. Mike Doc Stater, Wendy Hill as well was very influential and has provided with me so much that she probably doesn't even know how she's affected me in my lifetime. But when I'm going to just tell you this story before we move on, and this is how magnificent things happen with us as Indigenous people. This is how we're all connected, and it just happens organically and spiritually for us. I was asked to go and speak. I don't know if you remember, Jody, but many years ago here, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, there was an international elders conference that was happening on Six Nations down at Chippewas Park. And so I was asked to go and speak and given space and time to go and talk about Two-Spirit people and to have a very uncomfortable conversation with elders and healers and traditionalists in our communities about their roles and responsibilities towards Two-Spirit people. And this came out as a result of what happened within the federal institutions that I talked about, that confrontation that was happening and the homophobia that happened. So I was selected to go there. And something had happened to me spiritually that I needed to go and see somebody right away. And so a friend of mine took me and connected me with Wendy. And Wendy sat down in front of me and she looked at me and I could feel this. It was like a cool wind that went through my body. And she got up and she said, "I'll be right back." And then she come back and she said, "I don't know what this means, Lyndon. I have no clue of its interpretation. I've only been told and guided by my spirits that this means something for you." And so she had this empty bowl in her hand, and she put her hand into this bowl like this. And then she pulled it out and she started going like this, like she was sprinkling water on me. And she said, "I have no clue what that means, but spirits tell me that means something to you." What Wendy was doing and she was reminding me of a medicine that my parents used when we were infants and in our bedrooms. And so that was what I needed. That spiritual happening that was taking place was calling for this medicine to be built and brought to me. That's what Wendy did. And she had that impact on me because it was just at one of those points in your life where you need that reaffirmation that this is real. The spiritual connecting is real. And that's what's happening in Halton. And that's what's happening with this series is you grandmothers are connecting all of us as Indigenous people spiritually, and it's just been such a magnificent and beautiful experience that I carry with me now, and it's become part of my bundle. So chimigots for that.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing too. As you're talking, I have all of these stories too. We could make a series out of you and I talking, I think. You, myself,
so.
and sharing. But I just have to say for Wendy, it's funny. I mean, a lot of the people that have come together from the series, my journey has been grandmother Sherry. My journey has been that I believing in, because I'd never had that connection to, traditional medicine. It was just me believing when I said I surrendered on the land 15 years ago, and I would listen and I would pay attention, and no matter what it was, I would do this. And even though my husband at some point in time thought I was crazy, called me a witch and all that other stuff, just because, that's just what my life is. I would be found even like with Sherry and Wendy Hill. I was in the middle of doing something and somebody told me, "You need to go to this event now. You need to go here now." And that same thing happened with me and you, Lyndon, when I met you in that circle. "You need to go here now." And I would go there, and then I'm like, "Okay, why am I here? What am I doing here?" And then it was that person 2 seats over for you is you need to, right? So
Yeah.
so all of that resonates with me. And And, you know, we're in a time right now, maybe if we had this conversation 50 years ago or 30 years ago, maybe 10, I think even 10 years ago, it would have been, yeah, right? You have to be really close with those people that you have those conversations with. But right now, people are awakening. And they're awakening to understand that it's not just this physical body that we're here in. We're here in spirit. We're here in past. We're here in other realms. And, you know, my message is if you believe it, your life becomes magical.
Absolutely.
I love you, man. I love you.
I'm
I
so
love you.
excited.
So
I'm
excited.
so excited. We're going to go on this journey together. Like this is so exciting. I'm so pumped with energy.
I know, me too. I love that. Hey, Sherry. Sherry's watching now. She couldn't jump on, but I just wanted to express to everyone that continues to show up and share Grandmother's voice. We have some amazing announcements coming up. Here's Sherry. We might as well bring her on before we go. Just to say that we have some amazing announcements coming up, some really beautiful things happening. If anyone out there wants to get involved with what Grandmother's Voice is doing, we're just Sherry and I agreed this morning, and Grandmother Renee agreed that we're just doing it now. Now we can't even control the magic that's happening. Every day some other gift shows up and says, this is the opportunity. You're on a roll. You're making space. The families are showing up, which is so amazing. You know, people are saying, I see what you're doing. My children are ready. And so this is a really powerful time. And Lyndon, it's just wonderful to have you here. Yeah. So Sherry, go ahead if you want to say something. We've talked a lot.
I was just listening at the back end after the meeting that I end up having with the politicians, and telling them, you know, that Halton does need a space, and Halton needs to, and we're doing it, whether we're having the assistance from the politicians or not, because it's coming from the community, and it is coming from those voices that are asking and saying, we need a safe place to come. We need to tell our stories. And like Grandma Renee said yesterday to us, she said, like, they've also been asking for a space for the old people to come together, to be in community together. And I think that is so important as well, because not only do we need their gifts, but they also need each other so that they can be held up and be supported through the journey that they're on as well. So we're just, every single morning I wake up and Jody's either text me or said, like, I had this dream, and you know, Spirit woke me up, right? And then and every time she phones and I saying, like, what miracle happened today? So I'm waiting for her famous actor to be almost to text her and say, hey, how can I help?
Sorry, I muted you, Lyndon, because there was some back noise. Go ahead.
Oh no, that's okay. That's okay. No, I was just agreeing with her. It's like it's magnificent when we have these big awakenings, but it's also significant when we have the small awakenings too, and that we're connecting with each other and connecting with other people, and that as much as we want folks to, I'm mindful of years ago when I went down to New Credit, and Phil Fontaine and Murray Sinclair were there, and Murray Sinclair said something that I can't get out of my mind, and I find that we carry these nuggets with us. You know, one of the things, for instance, that Isaac Murdoch said that has left an imprint on me is that we need to remember that even if we're just on the land, we're having ceremony. And that means so much, because that's reflective of what it's like when I go out into the bush or I'm by the water, that I feel this power and that ceremony. So he's reminded me through those words that we're engaged in ceremony. But these little niblets of information that we picked up, but Murray Sinclair down on New Credit said that if we're waiting for our knight in shining armor to show up, he's not coming. So if you want something done, just do it and deal with the repercussions later. And that is how I've been living my life ever since I heard those words, is that we have to be willing to take those chances. We have to be willing to put ourselves out there, which was kind of conducive already to how I had lived my life, walking up and down Highway 21, protesting, wanting our land back, then fighting for queer Indigenous rights and equality. You're always having to put yourself out there. So those words from Murray Sinclair just mimicked already how many of us, yourselves included, have been living our lives, that we have to just put ourselves out there, and we're going to make it happen regardless. We're going to find that space. We'll make it happen.
Yeah, amazing. I know, it's so exciting. This is like what Renee felt yesterday. We had a really great conversation about everything that's happening right now. And she posted on Facebook, she said that, I don't even feel like, everything that I had planned has gone away now. I don't even know what to do. And that's really how I feel. And even another person that step, has come forward to offer support in our community said the same thing. She's like, every time I talk to you, I know or before I talk to you, I know exactly what I'm doing. And then after I talk to you, I have all of these beautiful visions and I don't know what to do first. So I'm like, I guess that's what I'm supposed to do, is just, keep everybody excited about what's coming. So we have some wonderful things happening, and our community will hear very soon. We'd love to engage them to take a part and be a part of the foundation of what we're creating here in Halton. We will never turn anyone away that wants to offer support in any way, shape, or form. And so we're just, I think Sherry and I were a little bit, I want to say, hesitant, just because of things that just things that you deal with, right? And having that courage to go forward. But we've been reassured through our ancestors and our friends that have come forward to say we are supporting 150% of what you're doing. So thank you so much. Lyndon, we'll see you in the back room in like 2 minutes.
I'm so excited. All right.
2 seconds. See you, everyone, and we'll see you tonight. Jane Burning, yes. Friday at noon with
Uncle Mike,
Uncle Mike, and Grandmother Renee, and then next week we have another lineup. See you then.
Bye bye.